Okay, that thing woke up. You all awake? That's cool. I was a bit afraid nobody would show up. I tried to pick the most clickbaity keywords in the title here, but I refrained from using Prometheus. I'm still trying to give a talk where I never mention Prometheus. That might be one of them, but now my chairman already took it. I have to correct, I'm not a founder of Prometheus. I have been there pretty early on, but there are only two founders. And yeah, but anyway, SRE, DevOps, Google, and you. This is kind of what this is meant to be. What is SRE? That was a quite mysterious question for a while, but now we have books and talks and whatever. Also, I put this down here. If you look at the conference schedule, the first sentence in the talk section is, these talks are perfect fit for cloud-native engineers and SREs. So in case you didn't know, what you are listening to all day and yesterday is a perfect fit for SRE. So I hope you know a bit what it is. DevOps is also a question, right? We had Shlomo's talk yesterday, giving us new insights, what DevOps actually is, and then, of course, SRE DevOps, how does it relate to each other? And then Google, I think Konstantin said that famous phrase like Spotify didn't become Spotify by copying Spotify, so why should you? Now Google is even bigger than Spotify, and yeah, why should we copy Google? And SRE is a Google thing, something. But perhaps it applies to you, and by you I mean us or me. We'll talk about that too. These are the books, right? I mean, this is a complex, wide field, and you need to read a book, or you read 3 books, and I cannot compete with Mono Railroad, but I have physical items here. So these books are actually all there in paper, and it looks a bit like an O'Reilly product presentation, but I don't get any money from O'Reilly. I just have a personal relationship to each of these books. So you have to forgive me that I put them here. It's essentially a record of the last 13 years of my job. Those books in a row. Also, I had the honor to contribute a tiny bit to every single one. So I'm one of the persons whose name is in every single one of these books. But like I was reviewing the first 2, and I had the honor to contribute a chapter to the 3rd one. And this has to do with this talk. We will look at it. So they're all here. You see what SRE stands for now, because it's the title of the first book, Site Reliability Engineering, with the subtitle, How Google Runs Production System. SRE is also the acronym for the person who is doing the craft of SRE, the Site Reliability Engineer. And I was such a site reliability engineer from 2006 to 2013, the original, made by Google, invented by Google, whatever, they coined the term. Back then, nobody knew what it means. We even put it out of the job descriptions at some point because people were just confused. I was so keen on telling people what I'm doing, but Google was so secretive, and I always had this feeling I have to shoot everybody if I tell them what I'm doing. And then like I leave the company, and then they publish a book and they spill all the beans and they tell you how Google runs production systems. It's not a secret anymore. It's pretty exciting to read that. I mean, of course, it's my personal bias, my narcissism, that I love my job, and so now I love the book where they describe my job. But a bit surprising, I guess, even to the authors, this book became a bestseller. People bought this book, they loved it, everybody talked about it. Also, of course, Google mania, we can do everything like Google does. We'll come to that. But people also ask questions. They ask like, okay, this tells me about the fundamentals of SRE. That's great, but I want like practical applications. Also, Google is Google and I'm not Google, so how does that apply to me? How can I actually make use of those principles in my culture and at my scale? And Google SREs were listening, so, oh no. Is it me? going on and off? I don't know. It's also tired. They listened to you or us, and so they created this other book. This one, the workbook. It's also a real book. So this is focused on more practical applications. Some things in the book are going into amazing detail. Like one of the chapters is essentially about the system I was on call for years, and I was so keen on telling everybody about it, and now they write it all into a book. Great. Also, they have a bit of a focus on non-Google people, non-Google companies, and they give a bit of case studies. But even with all the details they go into, this is already really valuable as a workbook, cookbook, whatever. By now, both books are available online. You can just Google for SRE book, and then you get the page where you can just read them for free on the web. But sometimes I love those paper dead tree versions, which I can read somewhere if I'm offline. But then, Seeking SRE, what is that? That's kind of the third SRE book. The workbook and the Seeking SRE were created in parallel, because this is now done by somebody, David Blank-Edelman. He is not a Googler. He thought, why shouldn't we just ask people who are not Googlers, but they think they're doing SRE, and share their experience? Okay, this display is not very reliable. So that's Seeking SRE, another animal. And this is now really mostly written by non-Googlers who share their experience. And one of the non-Google company that is sharing their experience is SoundCloud. So Matthias, a colleague of mine, and myself. Do you think it's me? That would be... Yeah, but then it will take us like 10 minutes to get all this running. So what's the problem? Is it the adapter? I mean, as long as this is on now and then, I think it's fine. Also, the book is here. The book will not switch off all of a sudden. But many other companies have written chapters there. I really love it. Like, of course, I love my own chapter, but I also love all the other chapters. This is really because those companies are way more like us. That's why I said, like, if I say you, I mean us. I mean, most people here in the room probably don't work for internet giants. They work for like some mid-size tech company, with exceptions, of course. But yeah, I think you can relate to a lot of these stories in that book. So now SoundCloud. That's a story where I say you can take SoundCloud as kind of the proverbial role model for your own startup or for the mid-sized company you work for. SoundCloud might be rather extreme in many aspects, but I even think those extreme aspects make it an even better example. We have this weird tendency of like early adapting bleeding edge technologies, but then you can learn from our mistakes. So microservices, for example, like people still talk about microservices as a fairly hot new thing. Perhaps not that new anymore, but when it was new and hot, then SoundCloud was totally on it, right? I'm pretty sure on the microservice Wikipedia page, SoundCloud was mentioned as like an example company. It has disappeared now, perhaps, I don't know, too much advertisement or something, yeah. So we did microservices, and we also fell into many traps when doing that. Then containers. Now everybody talks about containers, but that mostly happened when Docker became a thing. SoundCloud used containers before Docker even existed. Google, of course, used containers even 5 years earlier. But yeah, Prometheus was mentioned. That's the monitoring system that we now all love and even use to monitor our wind parks. That was more or less invented at SoundCloud. So yeah, kind of early adapters. Kubernetes, we were also pretty early with Kubernetes, but we had our own container orchestration platform before that. Still, I think because we went through all those stages, it's quite interesting to study how we as a fairly small company, how it worked out for us. And what I usually say, failing at SRE before it was cool. The SRE is the same story again. When I joined SoundCloud 2013, bit by coincidence, bit because I already knew it, there were like a handful of ex-Google SREs in the company. Like about 100 engineers, and 5 of them are ex-Google SREs. That's kind of a culture injection, if you want. Also, microservice migration, everything was really not very stable, reliable, available. Our joke was always that people don't even tweet about SoundCloud anymore. If it's down, they tweet about SoundCloud when it's up. Yeah, so there was this kind of idea. We have all those Google SREs. They have magic G1s, and then we wave the magic G1s, and the site is reliable again, right? Unfortunately, they took away our G1s when we left the company. So you are not Google. That was also something going viral in 2017. There was this nice blog post by Ozan, and this went so viral that the Changelog, a pretty good open source centered podcast, created a whole episode about this. So if you haven't read that or listened to that, it's really inspiring. I would recommend it. They have this funny thing here in the bottom. The Google Mania in the 2000s, we'll do everything the way Google does because we also run the world's largest internet data service. Yeah. Interestingly, I mean, Bill had this in this non-technical explanation of Kubernetes that this is the most primitive thing that non-technical people think, oh great, Kubernetes, we can now run everything exactly like Google does. And it seems like a good thing. Kind of is not, I think. But on the other hand, I claim that this Google Mania in the 2000s was actually way worse, in quotes, than what we have now, although it was less justified. Okay. So I think today we are, you don't have to look at this if it goes off and on. I think today we are actually so much closer to how Google runs. Like we run Kubernetes, right? I mean, some of us, but we all want to run Kubernetes. We run Prometheus. We can just use a cloud offering to spin up exactly the technology that Google, Amazon, Facebook, whatever, are using. Well, back then in the 2000s, that was just like a pipe dream. When I joined my first day in the office in 2006, I kind of felt I'm going, like, it's now a science fiction movie. They still, like, I see some of the terms, like they're using programming languages. I know they're using, like, even the MySQL database, which was super secret back then, that Google would use the MySQL database. But anyway, but still, like, everything else was, what? Like MapReduce, GFS, Borg, I don't know. Like, that was all weird stuff. Nowadays, if you get a job at Google and you start tomorrow, you know, kind of realize this monitoring system looks similar to what I know, and this like Borg thing looks like Kubernetes. It's like we are way closer to how Google runs. But still, we should still be aware that we are not Google, and we have to consider things. And the things to consider are scale, 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 and culture. This is how I phrase it usually. Google, SoundCloud. Again, SoundCloud is just you and me, right, as a role model. And there are different scales. Users, of course, like an internet giant like Google has the world as users. This is super ballpark, nothing confidential, just what kind of makes sense. So Google has billions of users. Well, SoundCloud, I mean, perhaps surprisingly, has hundreds of millions of users. But that's how it works today, right? You have a little startup, you suddenly become successful, you can just scale up with your Amazon, Google, Azure, whatever cloud thing, and you have 100 million users, which is only an order of magnitude off, right? I mean, that's easily possible. Then Google has tens of thousands of engineers. Your mid-sized startup, if it has 100 engineers, is already pretty big, right? I mean, SoundCloud has, last time I checked, 127 engineers. So that's 2 orders of magnitude difference. So there's already a bit of discrepancy, but what's most important in my opinion is services, whatever services is. Like it's a product, it's a microservice, it doesn't even matter for those like broad numbers, because Google certainly has a lot of services, but they have more engineers than services, broadly speaking, right? Now you might be the single B2B feature startup, you have essentially one product. lucky you, because that's way easier to manage. But often you find yourself, like SoundCloud, you have all those different groups of customers. Like we have uploaders, creators that upload music. We have rights holders that want reporting and royalties. We have advertisers that want to manage the ad campaigns. And then, of course, we have listeners who listen to the music and hopefully the ads, or they pay for subscriptions. This is a lot of different groups. And we have, as I claim, we have more services than engineers. And that makes a huge difference how you operate things. We'll see that later. And culture eats strategy for breakfast, as they say, and also like looking through the program at this conference, I think a third of the talks is essentially culture talks, right? And DevOps is very much a culture thing, and it's really complicated. But everybody has a different culture, and you cannot just copy like how another company works without taking this into account. Okay. So this is essentially setting the stage. What you should do now, you should start a reading club and you read those famous, fabulous books, and then you will learn a lot, and I should stop talking now, I guess. But then, of course, we have a bit of time left, and you should make use of that. The reasonable strategy would be I give you a short introduction to SRE, as Google is doing it, takes like 30 minutes. Then I tell you the SoundCloud story, how we failed and then succeeded, which takes like 45 minutes. And then we are already out of time, and I could go on like this for the whole day. So that's not working. So my idea is I give you this one sentence explanation of SRE, and then I talk a short while about SRE and DevOps, and then I'll open the stage and we do like a long Q&A, and you can ask me anything. Like I have seen the normal world of mere mortals at SoundCloud. I have seen Google from the inside as an SRE, and you can ask me anything you like, even about Prometheus if you really want to. Okay, so this is the famous one-sentence explanation that Ben Traynor, head of SRE, inventor of SRE if you want, gave. SRE is what happens when you ask a software engineer to design an operations team. That's also written in the book, of course. And this is, you really have to take in every single word of this, because essentially everything else follows from that. And I would like to note, operations team. SRE is an operations team. In a way, it's not like DevOps, it's ops. It's bloody ops. But it's done with the mindset of a software engineer. You could say a software engineer is a developer, so we kind of have dev and ops in there. But it's very important to know that SRE is a dedicated ops team. A team dedicated to ops, but also dedicated to reliability as their core KPI. That's also pretty important. Reliability is every product's most important feature. If your product is great, but it's never up, like SoundCloud. I mean, it's not true that SoundCloud was never up, but like it doesn't help if every feature doesn't count if it's not up. Okay, and then of course, SRE, DevOps, kind of independent development. I can give more details if you like me to do. But it became a hot thing, especially with the book. That first book came out 2016. And then in the workbook, the first chapter is how SRE relates to DevOps. And what they kind of settle on is class SRE implements interface DevOps, which is a nice way to put it. We can discuss that if you like. Also, and I really like that one, this is from Seeking SRE. They have a whole chapter 12 here, where David Blank Edelman, the editor, he asked his peers or all of you on Twitter and told them, please give me like a one-paragraph explanation, what's the difference between SRE and DevOps? Like not necessarily define both, but just tell me the difference. And then, I don't know how many people responded, but he gives a whole list of, this is how it looks like in the book, little statements about how SRE and DevOps differ, and they are great. Like it's so much fun to read through this because, of course, people disagree on it, but every statement has a bit of wisdom, and you kind of see there's a larger picture in it where we kind of agree what it is. I mean, you can define so many different angles. This one is my favorite, and I was really reading it and was thinking, this isn't really interesting to look at it. It kind of went from like looking at where's the focus in the software delivery lifecycle, and then I turned the page because it ends not quite here, and you turn the page, and then I saw, oh, it's Tom Limoncelli. You might know him. He was exactly in Google SRE at the same time as I was. We were in the same onboarding class, but he was already famous back then for his time management for sysadmins book. Like, he is kind of a little celebrity in a way, but he also says like really nice things and has a lot of experience and wisdom accumulated. He's also giving like loads of talks at DevOps events and everything. So this is really great to read. So now, this is what I want to do. Everything you always wanted to know about SRE, but were afraid to ask. If you have like a question you really want to ask, just do it. Like, we have a microphone quickly. If you cannot come up with something, I have a few like buttons here you can push, like conversation menus in this Monty Python movie. But most of the time, whenever I give this kind of talk, then people have questions. And somebody already raised their hand. Okay, now we need a microphone. All the technology. This works. I also have like, my slide deck is like all in there, but we might not even need slides.
Okay,
please.
In the SRE book, I noticed there's a big focus on RPCs and very little about messaging. So is that like, does Google say, okay, RPC is better than messaging, or is it just the way the services work to respond faster and stuff?
Okay, I mean, that's a very detailed technical question. I think it's just coincidence. I mean, Google uses all of these technologies. Is this in the workbook or in the first book? Okay, because there's a whole chapter about the project I was involved with, which is essentially a pipeline. It's not quite messaging. Perhaps it is. I don't know. I think it's just. I mean, the important bottom line, I think, is SRE doesn't tell you use technology X. Even the word container. In the first SRE book, I think the word container is not mentioned a single time, or the word CI/CD. I think you can check it out, but it's not important. Like, it's not. This is essentially what Shlomo said, right? You cannot just use a technology and then you are doing SRE or you're doing DevOps. It's about the ideas, the principles, and it can apply to any technology. And like, Google certainly has no opinion about you should use RPCs instead of messages. It depends on your problem. But whatever you do, you can and have to apply DevOps/SRE principles to it. So I wouldn't focus on the example they use as a technology. Does that? Okay, he nods. Anything else? Yeah.
Björn, hey. So you probably know Louis a bit, right? So we have a SRE enablement team in Zalando. So it's not like a ops, because you said SRE as ops, but the mission is more like kind of introducing the right mindset and the right terminology and tools like SLOs, error budgets, etc. Would you say that this is the strategy, basically not the end goal having SRE as ops or the role SRE, but actually like introducing the right set of tools and methodologies? Is this something you would advise people to start with, or more like looking at the end goal of having a SRE role?
Okay, so if I understand correctly, what should you be aiming for? Introduce principles, where should you start?
Or let's rephrase it, is this still SRE for you, or is SRE really by the book, the SRE role, and should this be trademarked?
Yeah, so if you do SRE by the book, you really have to take the book and do it, right? But that will most likely fail. And perhaps I should quickly say, like SoundCloud, I like to say that SoundCloud was doing SRE by the book before there was a book, because we had those Google SREs in the company and there was no book yet, but the content of the book was already in our brains, and we totally failed. But that was, for example, I mean, there are reasons for it, and that really depends on your organization. I think the one-to-one Google SRE model applies to very large organizations in principle, because you are the size where you kind of have to short. You cannot necessarily have this team, like a feature team that goes through the whole stack, because every component of that stack is too big. Well, in a company like SoundCloud, it's the opposite. Like if you do a feature team, then probably every component is too small, right? I think I talked to somebody at the conference where SoundCloud started feature teams, and then there was one iOS developer in that feature team to implement that feature on iOS, and that was like devastating if you have no peers to talk to anymore. So it really depends on your scale, and I would say, to take the words from your question, you should totally apply SRE principles, or you have to. Even if you don't notice, you will apply them. But you will most likely not end up with an SRE model like Google. You might, depending on your size and this feature to engineers ratio, you might end up with a dedicated SRE team. But SoundCloud, as an example, we don't have a dedicated SRE team. The team I'm in is called Production Engineering, but it's in many ways not an SRE team. Like we could, if we map our own role, at SoundCloud, essentially everybody takes a bit of an SRE role, because we are kind of this full through the stack. I sometimes call it true DevOps because we don't separate between Dev and Ops. I think now, Shlomo gave me the keyword, we are beyond driving school. We never called it DevOps at SoundCloud. People ask us, are you doing DevOps? Because like people notice Prometheus, and then people ask, is Prometheus a DevOps tool? And I said, are we actually doing DevOps? And then I realized we're kind of doing, it's normal, right? This is the perfect wording. It's normal, we don't even call it that way. But that also depends how broad and how deep you are. And so some people, everybody essentially has to wear an SRE hat now and then. While the team that is most close to an SRE team is production engineering. But we, for example, we have developed Prometheus. We even have developed an orchestration platform before we just adopted Kubernetes. And that's at Google, that would be developer teams who develop Borgmon or Borg. And then there are SRE teams who run Borg or Borgmon. And we do both of them, so it's kind of really a different distribution of tasks. But it really depends. You really have to see the principles always work. And I have this, because I have like bonus slides. Here, this is the one. This is one of my favorite illustrations from the book. This is the Dickerson's hierarchy of service reliability, which is named after Mikey Dickerson, another person that I work closely with at Google. Does that name ring a bell? He is the essentially founder of the US Digital Services, that famous startup within the government. He was sitting in the White House directly because the US government realized how government is doing IT projects is just not going to work. And they created that thing modeled by how Mikey rescued healthcare.gov. Like, it's a long story. Mikey gave many talks about it. It's kind of legend by now. But when he was in that role, and he had to explain to all those government people and government contractors and whatever how service reliability or site reliability works, he came up with this pyramid or hierarchy modeled on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you might have heard is this thing that humans need like shelter and food first, and if they don't have that, nothing else matters. And all those things where we think are the most human, highest value accomplishments, like self, whatever, philosophy, it's on the top, right? And that's, in our service, that's the product. The one thing where we think that matters is actually only the tip of the pyramid. And everything else has to be built from bottom to top. Like without monitoring, you cannot have incident response. Without incident response, you cannot have a proper postmortem and root cause analysis, blah, 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 all the way up. And this is kind of science. This is, even if you don't know about it, and SoundCloud didn't know about it, even SREs didn't know about it, because Mikey invented this when he had to explain to the government IT people how that works. And then the SRE said, this is exactly how it works, and they put it into the book. But I've never seen that thing while I was at Google, and I've never seen it while I was at SoundCloud. But guess what? What was the first thing we did when we realized we have to make our site reliable? We did not only apply proper monitoring, we invented Prometheus to make it possible. So that's the base, right? And then it goes on. Everybody has to follow that. Or, I mean, if you don't, you just have a lot of friction. But that's the kind of science part, the principle. How you implement it. Do you have a dedicated SRE team? Is it more Google-like? Is it more like full stack? Everybody does ops and dev. that depends on your culture and your skill. Okay, like a long-winded answer, but I hope I got it a bit. We have more time, more questions.
Any other questions? Come on.
You can ask as many questions as you want. There's no queue.
So, what were some failings at SoundCloud?
What was the one?
What were some failures?
Okay, let's talk about failures. The whole story is really nicely spelled out in the book. I talked to some people who were also like during they had the whole journey, and they said that was not really how it worked. And then we said it's a bit like glossed over the history. We kind of try to not be like a precise historical account, but more like show the big picture, how it works. And like the spirit or the message is correct. And the first thing that happens, of course, magic G1s, SREs, and then what you first think, we didn't even try that because we had already failed before. The first idea is Google SRE, dedicated SRE team. And that means, I think I have a slide for that even. Let's see. These are all the many DevOps slides. This is, for example, this kind of goes into it. Because there are a few concrete things in the first SRE book, and one is very concrete, how they tell you how large an on-call rotation should be for like proper work-life balance and everything. And this is a very concrete number in the first SRE book. If you have multiple rotations that follow the sun, every location should have 6. If you're like 24/7 in one location, you should have at least 8 people in your on-call rotation. And I really believe into that number. Like if you're on call, you should take it seriously, right? And you should also take your work-life balance seriously. So this is kind of my magic number. And then an SRE team, this is something that we totally don't do at SoundCloud nowadays. And also, we had this DevOps bullshit phrase, like DevOps are the people who take the pager, which is like not true, but SREs are the people who take the pager, right? That's a very important part of it. Since we want to copy Google, we take a dedicated SRE team that takes the pager. Since they are on a rotation then, they need at least 8 people. Now, what's your percentage of your total engineering population you can invest into SRE? 5%, 10%? Probably not like 25% or something. So SoundCloud, 100 engineers, 10% of it is the SRE team. The number of SRE teams that SoundCloud could afford is 1, right? So that's kind of what we didn't do because we already knew it would fail, because we already had back then for a while a team that got all the pages. And that doesn't work. Because if you have 100 services and one team gets pages from 100 different services, no team will be smart enough to react in a competent way to those pages. And that's what an SRE also has to do. An SRE should be able to competently react to pages. We had this joke, like when I was struggling explaining to my friends what an SRE is doing, one of my colleagues told me, yeah, I tell you what you're doing. The SRE gets the page from the pager and then takes it to the developer who caused it. That's the job of an SRE. Of course, that's not the job of an SRE. That would be the job of a pager monkey. And SRE is not supposed to be pager monkeys. This is a common misunderstanding. It's like some people actually introduced SRE by name, and then that's just exactly their job. It's not true, right? I mean, it's true that companies did that, but it's not true that it's SRE. So you want to react in a competent way to that, and that means you cannot be on call for a huge diversity of features. You have to know a bit about the systems you're on call. So that didn't work. And since we already had for a while an ops team, it was actually called ops, that got all the pages, and we realized they are just pager monkeys. We didn't do that. So next thing is, and that's also explained in the books, you do something called embedded SRE. And that might totally work given your culture or whatever. So what we did, we have those 5 SREs. We put a few non-ex-Google people there. We had this SRE team. Now it wasn't a really feature team, but let's say every team for a certain area in the company gets an SRE embedded, and this SRE will tell them how SRE works, teach them. That might work. It might totally work, but then it might be a culture thing. So back then, SoundCloud was into this. We are doing microservices. Everybody can use their preferred tool set, even if it's Haskell or Clojure or whatever, and share nothing. And then they suddenly get a person in their team, and they say, okay, this person will teach you SRE. They kind of already, they consider that, yeah, it's another backend engineer, probably, right? Even somebody who is like happy to carry a pager, or I don't know, whatever. Like it totally didn't work. There was an existing culture, and you cannot just expect by sprinkling a few people everywhere that they will change the whole approach and the culture. Because you don't even want to change the culture because you like your culture. You want to find a way to do SRE while applying your culture, right? And Google is like pretty authoritarian, if you want, like in a technical sense or in a good sense, I don't know. While SoundCloud was at that time was the opposite. Like everybody was running into different directions. It really didn't gel. And also because now the SREs were all sprinkled over the company, they felt lonely. They couldn't talk to each other. It's the same thing if your feature teams are too tiny and you have one iOS developer and one Java developer or whatever, and they cannot talk to their peers. So this really it didn't make any difference, right? We had to abandon that experiment. Nowadays, now that like the company has changed a bit, it might actually work. So it might be a good approach to embed SREs, but for us, it totally didn't work. That was one of the failure cases. Yeah, the total failure happened from then. It was more like incremental improvement, and we arrived at the model where we wanted to. Although one failure case was when we realized we cannot have one team on call for everybody, and we realized everybody has to be on call. That's the inverse, right? We fell into the opposite trap. So one trap is you have one team on call for everything, and they cannot competently handle that. The opposite is too specialized, which means you have like the two people who build service X are on call for that service forever. I mean, it's not 8 people, right? So that's against the rules of SRE, but also it ruins your work-life balance. You get perhaps paid for it, then you tell yourself, oh, it's fine, and I like the money. I mean, you don't say that, you just like the money, but then you think it's fine to be on call all the time. But then you have two specialized on-call rotations. That means people have silos. Ha, there's the word. So those two people are the only people in the company who know about that service. They siloed all the knowledge. They don't document it. They don't write runbooks. They even are fine with noisy alerts because they know every alert by heart, and they know this is the alert I don't have to pay attention to, and this is the alert that actually something happened, and I can do X to deal with it. It's really an anti-pattern, and it goes against all principles of SRE, although it has nothing to do with SRE, how Google is doing it. So then we realized, okay, we need big enough on-call rotation. We need to have meaningful alerts. Pages should be actionable. Runbooks, right? I mean, this is all what SREs would do at Google. So again, principles apply, although it's a very different form. Everybody's on call, not just SREs. So these were enough failures, and we are almost out of time.
Yeah, I think we started late, so actually we might have still one question left. Is that okay?
If there's a question,
Okay.
I will try to find a slide that. This is here. I'm so dynamic. I put Shlomo's principles here in case we needed to discuss them. This is this whole. This is when you're legend. This is the old slide I had about our team, what it's actually doing, Kubernetes and Prometheus. And now at Go Days, this is the T-shirt. The Gopher has a laptop and has those stickers there. Awesome. This is, it's all about Go. Anyway, this is not the one I wanted to. I don't know if I find it. No, I don't know if I find it. If there's a question, you can ask me now.
Yeah. Björn, I have one question. Like incident response here.
Yeah.
So incident response, stopping the bleeding. Okay, that's kind of the easy part because not the easy part, but that's how would you tackle the kind of for me the harder part to infuse kind of postmortem, collecting contributing factors, immediate action items, making sure follow-ups are done. What is your kind of strategy tips from your experience to because it's not limited to SREs, right? Barely like completing postmortems, contributing factors, and all the follow-up action items, they need to be done in the teams, not only a few people. How would you approach this to foster this?
So yeah, I mean, first of all, it's totally true. This is a very good example for it's about the principles, because everything you read about postmodern culture, about incident response in the SRE books, first of all, it's perfect mapping to whatever every DevOps person will tell you about that. That was also where you can kind of directly apply it. But your question was about how do you spread that knowledge, right? Now like if you look how Google is doing it, it's a lot about coercion or control. I think one of the first chapters, or even the first chapter in the Seeking SRE, is Netflix story, and they talk a lot about. They call it context. They say they provide context to people, and then they will understand. While Google is more about control, like they define mechanism where even like engineers that don't like to be like bullied around, how you make them do the right thing, right? But I think a large organization also has this problem that you really have to create mechanisms that set the right incentives so that engineers will do the right thing. While in smaller organizations, you can kind of hope for that you just tell, please be reasonable, be nice, and do the right thing. But again, that might depend on your culture. SoundCloud was definitely in the situation where people were so autonomous that you couldn't just tell them what to do. They just would think, yeah, but you do it that way, I do it my way. And then you kind of have to prove that it still doesn't work. I mean, it really depends. And I mean, SoundCloud, it was a pretty obvious thing when people realized that incident response actually helps. So nowadays, at SoundCloud, we have something called Uptime Academy. I just ran this on Monday, where essentially the first month during your time at the company, you go to a little workshop where we tell people about incident response and kind of nicely explain them how in a case of an incident, you switch into military mode, you have a like chain of command and you have to follow orders, and later we discuss this all in the postmortem. That kind of works, but it works in a soft way where we don't really have a lot of authority and coercion, but that might not work for everybody. I think that is more likely to work in smaller organizations where people immediately realize if I'm not following this, everybody will suffer and the product will suffer. The larger the product, you might just get away with it, and then you need more authoritarian structures, I think. You really have to figure it out, but the principles all apply. Also, like this whole thing about blameless postmortem culture and everything, it's of course really important. I sometimes, like when some people tell me from some seemingly successful companies how their postmodern culture works, I think this is not going to end well. But most people have understood now that this is essential. Blameless postmodern culture, and then also incident response improves, and blah, blah, blah. There's a whole talks in this. Okay, now we are really done.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks a lot.